from Jamaica. Not Jamaica, he's from Trinidad and Tobago. That's one of the islands, and that's kind of like near Jamaica, and all these runners from Jamaica, and wow, what a stereotype that would be. You're making all these assumptions along the way. Okay. Maybe we beat that up enough. Okay, we're looking at chapter 3. We're going to start chapter 3 today. Okay. Well, that didn't come out very well in terms of reading. I'm sorry about that. The print. Let me read that for you. At the right is the heart and soul of MVNU Sport Communication. What you see is part of the 2019-2020 master schedule for all teams. Competition continued halfway through March when all sport contests were canceled due to the virus. We're looking at this chapter as kind of a historical chapter. And if you are going to be a student of sport management, and in particular sport communication, then we have to start sort of at the beginning of it and have a good feel for how it has progressed over the years. Now, a couple of really significant contributors to sport management. Grantland Rice was one, and he is considered to be maybe the first real sportscaster. He provided play-by-play for radio's first coverage of the World Series. He and Bobby Jones, if you golf or follow golf, every so often you hear somebody mention Bobby Jones, and it's usually in relation to the Masters. Well, Grantland Rice and Bobby Jones were responsible really for bringing golf into what it is today. And then the preeminent writer for baseball was a guy named Henry Chadwick. Now that's a name that was unfamiliar to me and probably is to you. But he's the one that developed a lot of the standards by which we evaluate players. Now it's interesting, baseball, maybe more than any other sport, at least in my opinion, has ways of keeping records and well, this player did this many times in this particular situation. And it becomes a way of coaching, a way of recruiting. But he started all this. He's the one that came out with the first rule book. And I understand that obviously it's different now, but it is based on some of what he did a century ago. So if we look at different periods within sport management or sport industry, we have the early eras of sport journalism, then what we call the golden age, the perspective period, transition years, and then here's where we stick a couple names in, the influences of Rozelle and Arledge, Pete Rozelle and Roone Arledge, and then today. This is another way to list these eras. What they call the pioneer era. This is before 1830. And then the age of acceptance, when sport began to be recognized as a legitimate activity, maybe even a way of life. the golden age, the prospective period, and then transition use. And then there's one more there that is an interesting way of looking at it. The agricultural age, which is late 18th century, early 19th, and then the industrial age that goes along with the Industrial Revolution, the late 19th through the 1980s, and then the information age. And that makes sense, doesn't it? The information age, and then the digital age. That's where we are now. At the right, that picture is a boxing match from the 1920s. You know, boxing was not the spectacle that it really is today. You know, no pay-per-view kind of thing. But it was one of the most influential and most watched sports at the time. So here's some key developments, or key events in the development of sport communication. Now, when we look at a timeline, what it enables us to do is to get the big picture. It doesn't necessarily center on a particular time area, but it lets us look at it from this end to this end. So we're looking linearly. This particular time, this era, or the group of eras, starts with World War I, and then the attention to sport, into the 1920s, the cultural changes that come about, and then this golden age. You'll hear about, read this a lot. The sports writers recognized and satiated, they satisfied the desires of fans to know more about the sport. And radio was the primary medium. Oh, let's see. When was there no TV? You'd have to ask your grandparents, parents, or maybe even great-grandparents. Network TV, late 40s, probably more like early 50s, I would say. Late 40s, hardly anybody had TVs. I think our first TV was maybe 1953 or something like that. I was a couple years old. And then we get into NFL football, and so on and so on. And he takes us all the way to this digital era. And interestingly enough, with the advent of internet, there's literally no event in sport that cannot be broadcast and disseminated to consumers in real time. And that's an interesting statement to say. There's absolutely no sport event. Now you may, well, what about, they did this somewhere, nobody was there. Well, we have the possibility. The technology is there for any sports event to be broadcast in real time. And you think about that, the Olympic Games, for example, and NBC, I think it's NBC, has paid billions for the rights of that. And then we'll see a lot of that in real time. Journalism in the industrial age. Well, to understand this, you have to look at the culture of America at the time. What was going on in the industrial age? Child labor. Picture there on the left shows these little kids on these big machines. Kids often went to work before 10, and then before 10 years of age, and then they probably didn't get much or any education. You have to get a sense of overall journalism during that time. The overriding theme was this idea of social reform. Now, you may say, what's that have to do with sport? All of a sudden, sport journalism gave socially conscious journalists the opportunity to take on social reform in the form of what they call muckraking. Now that is not an unfamiliar term to hear, especially in these days as we approach the election. You may hear somebody talk about, well, that's just a lot of muckraking, and usually muckraking has a negative connotation, but in this case, it's not unlike editorial cartoons of today. Journalists portray the horrors of child labor. And you notice over here, in this cartoon, the effects of a strike. Well, you know, that is not so far off what we see in modern times. Here's the company owner, and he's still making money, but the person who's on strike, you know, they're looking for bread. And one might make a connection to that in regard to being laid off during the virus. And companies will, the other thing, maybe the difference is, you know, there's a lot of companies themselves that went under with that. But these are what the sport journalists of the day were concerned about. Social reform, and that's the way they wrote their stories. Sport, here's a quote, sport accommodated participants' desire to play, while at the same time enabling the advocates of sport to harness the play impulse to the new industrial order. Basically what they're doing is legitimizing sport in society at this time. You know, leisure was a good thing. You didn't have to work all the time. There was some disposable money. By that meaning that, you know, some people after paying their bills had a little money left over and they would spend it on leisure time activities. You ever heard of the Blue Law? Blue Law refers to something you can't do on Sunday. For example, years ago, when I was growing up, there was a lot of stores that participated in what they call blue laws for being open or selling alcohol. Now, you don't find too many that do that now, but sport was the same way. And interestingly enough, it sort of went along with a lot of people's idea of what should be done. Let me ask a question that I don't want you to respond to outwardly, I just want you to think about it. But did anybody grow up in a home where you know, Sunday was the Sabbath and you didn't do anything but just meditate and, you know, maybe take a nap, but, you know, certainly no sports? Now that's probably not as prevalent as you would find now. My guess is that some of your parents or grandparents may have been raised in a culture like that. I certainly was. But at least in terms of this industrial age, Sunday was not so much a day of, you know, recognizing the Sabbath as it was to, you know, take part in leisure time activities. Now, how that connects to what I just mentioned, you know, there's kind of dichotomous. Here I'm saying that you may be from a heritage of a family that treated Sunday a little differently than it has been recognized, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you'll recall that Jesus was questioned one time. Now it's not Sunday, it was the Sabbath there, so it would be Saturday. But Jesus was questioned one time by the Pharisees, and they said, what's the deal with your disciples? They're out there in the cornfield picking corn, and it's a Sabbath. You know, and Jesus ended up saying, well, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Which I love that. I love that statement. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't, have some respect and things that you do or don't do on our Sabbath, the Sunday, within Protestant church. But Jesus was simply saying, look, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so he's taking he's moving from the old covenant to the new covenant. Also about this time, they begin to have what they call trade papers. They were not so much, exporting news, nothing like that exactly. There was one called Sporting Life, and it was probably the very first one. But that is beginning to come around, and as it does, sport becomes legitimate. Well, here's the golden age of sport, and this is probably the first time that sports, really good athletes in sport, particularly pro athletes, become heroes, and likely so. Now here, I just told you earlier that even the talking dog knew that Babe Ruth was the finest, or one of the finest baseball players ever. Babe Ruth was like bigger than life. I mean, he was a big guy, but he was bigger than life. Probably made more money than the president at the time. But the other athletes of the day, Ty Cobb, Greg Grange, Bill Tindon, Bobby Jones, they were household names because sports writers made them their heroes. They talked about them, they wrote about them, they took pictures of them, they made movies about them. In fact, there's an old movie that it's black and white, obviously, but it's called The Pride of the Yankees. It's about Lou Gehrig. Now, Lou Gehrig, I forget who it is that played Lou Gehrig, but it was done far enough ago that Babe Ruth actually played himself in the movie. He was that big he wasn't necessarily a movie star, but he could make his presence known. Here's a quote from Grantland Rice, which is the one that we said is the very first sports journalist. He said, sport, games, hard competition played under the rules is the greatest thing a country can know. Sport offered the greatest fund of national entertainment. It offered relief from the drabness and dullness of making a living. It was a cure for lonesomeness, the dark specter so many people face. That's quite a statement. I'm not sure that it covers all that. And it was made in 1954, that statement. Is sport that big? Is sport something that cures us or satisfies our loneliness? Does it fill our lives? I guess that would be kind of a personal question. You'd have to answer that for yourself. But with the coming of the golden era of sport journalism, this is what they were experiencing. By the way, Grantland Rice was the one who gave Babe Ruth the title the Sultan of SWAT. The Four Horsemen. Now, you may, if you're not familiar with these four horsemen, you may be familiar with where in the book of Revelation talks about the four horsemen from the north. Well, that's where they got the name. It just so happened that these were players for Notre Dame back in 1924. That was the starting backfield. And here's an interesting description or categorization of sports writers and how they were considered. They were either what they called gee whizzers or what they called nuts. This is the way they wrote. They wrote in such a way that it was gee whiz. Or they wrote in such a way that read it? So here's an example of Grantland Rice's story about the four horsemen, and this would be considered one of these gee whizzers. Outlined against a blue-gray sky, the four horsemen rode again. In dramatic lore, they are known as famine, pestilence, destruction, and death. Out of the Bible. These are only aliases. Their real names are Stolbrayer, Miller, Crowley, and Leyden. They form the crest of the South Bend Cyclone, before which another fighting Army team was swept over the precipice at the Polo Grounds this afternoon as 55,000 spectators peered down upon the bewildering panorama spread out upon the green plain below. What a statement. Now, if that's not a gee whizzer statement, I don't know what is. I mean, you could really get, if you're a Notre Dame fan especially, you could really get all excited about that. The Four Horsemen of Notre Dame. Here's a sidelight. Grantland Rice, who wrote that quote, at the time, in 1925, he made as much as Babe Ruth did, $52,000. Can you imagine what $52,000 would be in today's money? Well, we know what some of the ball players get these days, and that would be kind of the equivalent, I guess. Gee whizzer and nuts. Here's an example of a writer who was kind of an nuts. His name was Ring Lardner. And here's his account of the 1910 Chicago White Sox versus the Philadelphia Athletics game. On my right sat a gent who knew something, and he soon gave evidence of the fact. Morris Rath opened the Sox attack with a safe bunt. He was nailed at second when Lord missed his swing on a hit and run. Stealing second with nobody out, remarked the guy who knows. And the papers called him a brainy bullpen player. If he had good sense, he'd trade all his brains for a little bit of ability. Yeah, that's kind of nuts. Last night, the movie just happened to be on The Natural. Anybody ever seen The Natural? Okay. With Robert Redford. And it's kind of a mystical, not mystical, but one of the best sports movies that's ever been made, I think. If you ever get a chance to watch The Natural, it's really good. And I was just thinking about how this particular team they were playing, it was a team called the New York Knights. It was the major leagues. And they were up and down in terms of their play. And there was one sports writer who was also kind of an illustrator, and he would make kind of like a caricature, and it would relate to what this particular player in question was doing, or what the fans thought he should do. Anyhow, he was definitely kind of an on-nuts writer. We were going to stop there. This is a little bit of a pickup on Tuesday. But here's what I'd like you to do in the remaining time. Now I know that you can't gather together, you can't move your desks or anything like that real close. But if you could just turn around and in a position that you can talk to 2 or 3 other people, like for instance, people guys can talk to each other, or just kind of pair it up somehow. What I want you to do is to come up with an example of a gee whiz statement and an nuts statement, and put it in today's language and today's athletes. Think about some ball player, some athlete, some kind of athlete, and you're journalist, and you're gonna come up with a short quote that is a gee whiz statement. And you don't have to use the same athlete or the nuts. Okay, so spend a little time doing that. Just, you can talk to those that are close to you. Just don't move your desk.
Yeah, seriously. Let's do that. I was thinking like cheating, lower traffic.